And right now, I do believe it is time for the Media Beat. The Media Beat, of course, with David Tereshchuk. David joins us live on a Friday morning, every Friday morning, or just about every Friday morning. We broadcast David during our 12 noon break and also on the weekends. Good morning, David.
Well, hello.
It's nice to have you on board again this morning.
Yeah, here I am back at my proper work base of the media capital of the world, New York City. I'm wondering if you've been getting, like I have, unidentified 202 area code numbers calling me all the time. I haven't answered them myself. I'm too scared that it's a recruiting call for the position of presidential chief of staff. Have they tried to get you interested in that?
It's interesting that you say that. I get 202, I get 860, I get Hawaii.
But there's a preponderance this week of 202. That's what made me suspicious and anxious.
It's interesting when you look at what's going on across the world. In England with Brexit, of course, and in Europe with Brexit. But then you come back over to the United States of America, and you just see mayhem in government. It's absolute mayhem.
Yeah, the word chaos automatically springs to mind. I guess it fully fits the label, I think.
It's pretty amazing, and when you zero in on either, well, in my opinion, you take a look at Brexit, you just know that Theresa May's career is finished. She happened to be the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah, and she's recognized that herself, saying that she will not be leading the Conservative Party again into an election. So that's pretty well signing the death warrant of your own career, isn't it?
It is, and also I just have a feeling that this whole thing might end with no deal at all, and England floating out on its own, which I think would bring a massive vote in favor of Brexit upon England. I mean, that's just my initial look at England. But when you look into America, the answer is not that easy. The answer is not going to come that quick. Because there is a slow-moving snowball that is only about started rolling at the top of a big, long hill that is going to take a while to roll down, and the mayhem might possibly turn to chaos.
And after that, do you see things coming back to anything like normal? I'm wondering about that.
Not for a long.
We know that this presidential period has been one of complete disruption. I think it's the kind word for it all, and indeed the word used by people who think it's a good idea to give the elite governing our country a major shake-up. That's one position that's not. I mean, it's not particularly logical, but it's widely shared, I believe. But if there's disruption, it could be for the good. If there's disruption, it could be forever. That's one thought I've been hearing again and again now. That it's after this presidency, things are never going to get back to anything like the normal flow of before. And some people would say that's a good idea.
Well, you're looking at a presidency in this country. A man was elected president who basically only was his own boss his whole life, his whole career. He had his family working around him. And anybody that expected any different...
Yeah, mom and pop business here in New York City. I mean, it seems like a contradiction in terms, but that's essentially what Trump Corporation was, and still is, of course. And as we know, he hasn't entirely pulled out of involvement in the company, although, normally that is presidential custom when a businessman becomes president. Or anyone with connections with business. Those are, by tradition and convention, cut off, those connections. But not this one, as we know, just yet another example of the unprecedented presidents.
But if anybody expected any different, they were crazy. The man was about 70 years old. He had run his business. He had been set in his ways, and he was out to change government. And
the fact is, and this is an oddness, because we touched upon this last week, and that is how everything is covered the exact same way. And then it's like, oh, disaster, it's like government shutdown, extension. So you have all of these things that are like every day, like this is terrible, this is terrible, this is terrible. He did this, he did that, this one did the other. And it takes the frustrating part from a news standpoint is you got everybody focused on that and nobody focused on like the actual nuts and bolts of news. And
but here's the problem, and David, I don't know if you're going to agree, or Joe, if you're going to agree or disagree with me. Yesterday was a prime example. I tried to stay away from the news, okay? I did not watch the news, but on other channels, a crawl came across, this happened, and then another investigation, this one by the Justice Department. These stories are emanating from within the government themselves. So here's the catch-22. News programmers have to go to those stories. And on a day where you have 3 stories break out of the government, one out of the 9th District out of New York, one out of Mueller's office, and one out of the Department of Justice on 3 different things, they have to be covered. And unfortunately, that takes over and that takes precedence, and all of a sudden, then the talking heads kick in.
Yeah, and then the talking heads talk about all that, and then meanwhile, what I thought was quite interesting this week. Let's forget breakfast. Let's forget breakfast. Let's forget
put it
Brexit.
on one side for a sort of a salutary moment.
Because the only thing that interesting came out of that is it shows you, just from a strictly numbers standpoint, forget everything, because this is all politics. It shows you exactly how many people on one side are not going to vote for this thing. So that's pretty much what you learned this week. Now, and then they can go back to their
in the British Parliament,
yeah.
At least, yeah.
Yeah,
okay, that much was settled.
Okay.
The Prime Minister of Great Britain has about a third of her own side against her. That's worth knowing. Yeah, that's a salient point that will guide us through the next few months. I
now,
think.
How long did that take us?
3 or 4 days of hysteria.
All right, but what I'm saying is to analyze.
But yes, to get the actual facts, about 20 minutes. Yeah,
right.
It was a very fast vote. Yeah.
Or even just this second, it took us about 18 seconds to convey to anyone who's listening. Right, the biggest thing that came out this week is that 1/3 of the Conservative Party is probably against Brexit. So add that to XYZ, and you've got a sense of what we're up against. So now we can move that to the side. Let's talk about the war in Yemen. All right. How long have
we should?
Well, we should. But the only way that it was presented was that I found in this country. Now, that doesn't mean it was the only way it was presented. I mean, I know that's not how it was internationally, but all I got is U.S. Senate votes something to end war going against the president.
Oh, sure. Casing it as a Congress versus president row. Yeah, when in fact, of course, it is the most appalling humanitarian crisis in the world today for many, many generations, in fact. And yes, and meanwhile, negotiations have been going on in a rather frenetic way. And we actually even have an agreement. There is now a strong possibility that the country's main port will be open again, and it's possible that humanitarian supplies can be brought into that country again, and then through various corridors provided outward to the people so desperately in need. Millions of children have died of starvation, and there's at least 1 million more teetering on the brink of starvation now. That's all. That's all of what's been. Well, it's not all of, but that's kind of what's been happening out in the world. While we've been engaged much more in the battle of, or one more strand in the battle between Congress and the president, or at least those elements of Congress who are prepared to go against him.
Here's the thing that I will say, though, and I lived through Watergate. I lived through the Vietnam War protests. I lived through Watergate protests. I can tell you right now that at 66, what is going on now in Washington makes everything else pale in comparison. And unfortunately, it's such a big forest fire in Washington. It is sucking up all the oxygen on a daily basis. It is just taking the media, all the media oxygen that's out there, and sucking it up, because each day you have things happen. This is what's happening
sure,
here.
And that is the thing. When there is chaos reigning, chaos does reign, and things go wrong, and things happen of a egregious kind, one after the other. And unfortunately, the media's job is actually to report them. Now, whether we should just do a kind of daily checklist devoting 18 seconds to each point, like Jill was suggesting, is perfectly possible with even very big stories, or whether we go into depth each day and just rehash the whole argument again and again and again. That I think that's a valid question. But what I don't think is. Where I think I do agree with Jill is that one problem is that everybody seems to be doing it the same way, and it seems like the same reaction to this plethora of chaotic stories, but ending up with just a general miasma of a mishmash, which it's very hard to see our way through.
I think you should get away from the mainstream media and look at the positive side of the story. Yesterday, 3 big stories broke. They were not stories that came from mainstream media. They were stories that came from newspapers, and I do believe newspapers are regaining their footing in the society that we have now with the presidency and following the things. And
the few newspapers that are left
are signing. I mean, the Wall Street Journal, which is a very conservative paper, was the one that broke the story about the possible the investigation on the possible misuse of funds that were raised, $100 million for the election party. You've got different
the inauguration.
Yeah,
sure.
You've got major papers that are actually assigning reporters to follow this and cover this.
Yeah, and that's been one of the when history is written and everyone looks back, there was an absolute the I don't want to say the Renaissance will be directly ascribed to this presidency,
and that's what
sure, and I can see that's happened, and I'm not saying that it hasn't. I mean, I one of the things that I've been somewhat heartened about our profession of journalism is that there have been points of excellence right across the board. This has been a time when really good journalism is needed, and guess what? I'm very glad to say that very good journalism has been restored across the board.
And there's also been.
But I guess what what Jill and I are both talking about is more I think what you hinted at yourself, Marshall, when you used the word mainstream. What's become the mainstream, I'm afraid, is cable news and 24-hour news, yep. and the hysteria of the internet too. That is what is setting the tone for our journalistic perception of the world, and America in particular. So that's a shame. I mean, you're right. There are points of excellence here, there, and everywhere, I'm glad to say. But the general mishmash is coming out of that box in the corner, I'm afraid.
And that's the problem. I had an idea today that will never gain traction, other than, like, all right, can we just synthesize this story? It's going to take literally 8 seconds. This is the main thing that you know. This is going to be the guiding bit along these lines. We have, it's always difficult in the 2 year right after there's a presidential election in this country for cable news, because they've got to keep their viewers engaged until the primary season starts. Ladies and gentlemen, the kickoff has begun. Right, so like everybody's already just breathless with their need to be like.
Yeah, politics is the horse race.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, so that's like the foals have been born. They've gone to yearling school. All right, we're getting ready. We're going to get them to the racetrack. All right, ladies and gentlemen, the 2-year-old season has started. And and here we are for 19. So my idea that will never gain traction is, if there's anybody out there, any kid who's actually interested in politics, you should be assigned to a candidate. All right? Now, this isn't about winning, choosing the candidate you think is going to win. And you should do a 1-minute report. We'll run it on this radio. A 1-minute report on that candidate that day. So, the thing that fascinated me, I sent this to Marshall first thing this morning. There was a meeting yesterday, apparently, between Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. That was designed basically, it was a courtesy, and if you follow this particular political newsletter, it was basically that both informed the other, each informed the other that they're interested in running for. They're going to pursue the 2020 as presidential.
A presidential run, in
Right.
other words. Yeah.
And when asked about this, when Bernie Sanders got back, the news reporters like, and he said, "Why aren't you asking me about this vote on the war in Yemen?"
Mm-hmm.
Now, that only got covered as an indication of how, like, what a snark bag he is.
Well, to me, that's not snarkiness.
No.
That's a reminder of what really big stories are compared with kind of incidental inside baseball type stories are.
Couldn't agree more. However, the coverage of that, that was only an aside to make an article interesting. It had no, it didn't pierce. And this reminds me terribly of 2015, 16, I can't remember the right dates. But, there was no coverage of, I'm not pro or con, I'm just saying there was no coverage of this movement that was developing for Sanders until... because it was all about Mrs. Clinton.
I know I was singing
No, it was all
journalism's
about
praise, but in
Trump.
fact, before this presidency, there was a remarkably sort of sleepy response by journalism generally to the Bernie Sanders development. You're absolutely right, and you guys were amongst the most vocal about saying. In saying that, hey, this is something that needs to be paid attention to.
Well, what the mainstream media did was create their own monster at that time, because it wasn't coverage of just Miss Clinton. It was coverage of Donald Trump, which became 24-hour-a-day coverage, 7 days a week, on every network except CBS, because CBS, they don't have a cable news channel like MSNBC or CNN or Fox. But it was Donald Trump all the time, every day. And thus,
we have the irony, if that's what it is,
Yep.
the chaos resulting from this presidency. Managing to create the resurgence of excellency in journalism, as we've just been saying, but in a way. It was very bad journalism that brought it about in the first place. The concentration on the circus nature of Trump's odd, to put it at its least, approach to campaigning was one of the reasons that he got more screen time than anybody else, and had a huge boost and a help from journalism itself into the White House and into the Oval Office.
And here's where the mainstream media is making a mistake on social media and on their cable news networks. Because they don't do it on their regular news networks, because they only have 26 and a half minutes to deliver the news, and so they do cover other stories. But unfortunately, more and more people are drawing back from watching those 30-minute newscasts and going to what's on the cable networks. They're now in their own catch-22. They're sucked in to what they're doing by the intensity of the blaze, and the
Sure.
more and the
Feed
more
the beast, and the beast will end up feeding you.
that's
yeah.
exactly what the problem is, and
Or eating you, rather.
Yeah.
and what the problem and what the problem is we are really living through an extraordinary time. I mean, it's extraordinary here what's going on with the presidency, and it's extraordinary what's going on in Europe with Brexit and with immigration problems, and it's just
And the yellow jackets,
yeah,
the
in
Gilets
France,
jaunes in France.
It's
too.
an
Sure.
we're in an extraordinary time here now, and worldwide, not only this country, and that's.
Well, that's because, with all respect, and this is my view, but the coverage of politics is so bloody divorced from what actual people are trying to do on a regular basis, and so it just creates a well, yeah, what? Okay, good. So it's like it really is like watching a TV show. It's like oh, that's happening over there. It doesn't have anything to do with what a lot of people are contending with, unless they're in the business, in their daily lives.
Sure, and I think the fight, the verbal fight, in the Oval Office this week between the Democratic leadership, Schumer and Pelosi, along with President Trump, that was an extraordinary. The circus element has taken over. It seems when that is regarded as a major news development and is treated as if that was an actual piece of political negotiation, when all it was a setup for the kind of reality show that Trump gained his main platform from in the first place.
And that makes me wonder, because that is so bloody obvious. And the minute that it happened, there were these news bites, and news bites are just in my view, alarming, because it's only it's one annoying phrase taken out of context, and that's it. That's the story. So you don't even have the whole picture. You have a selected phrase that is designed to create a view, and then it is banged on again unremittingly. They don't change the story. So basically, in this instance, you had, as I phrased it to Marshall, 3 New Yorkers yelling at each other.
Well, that's indeed is what it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even though
Sure,
Pelosi's from California, Baltimore originally.
The difference between a quick bite, especially if it's of some kind of snappy, snarky, or slamming back punchline of some kind, and the cogent but very brief summary that you were asking for earlier is all the difference between a brook and a chasm. I mean, the what we're being offered so constantly now is the punch in the face, which doesn't take very long. That's true, but it's the sort of just to be almost literal with one's verbiage rather. I mean, you could just say that this is sensationalism. It's all about sensation. It's all about the feeling of this thing, the loudness of it, the hurtfulness of it, the extraordinary unusualness of it, the surprising nature of it, the shocking nature of it. It's all as if every outlet, certainly in these sort of high figure range, the cable news 24-hour services in particular, it's just one big tabloid, and every screen, no matter which channel you turn to, will give you pretty much the same thing.
Right, and that's a massive frustration. A perfect example, actually. I mean, there's so many examples. It's frightening. But France, we had the the protests. We had the Macron speech on Monday, I think, and then there was the initial rejection. The boy prince, the this, the that. Horror, and then there was Strasbourg. We've got 3 minutes, I'm being told, and so. Forgetting, it's like, all right, well, that never happened, and we had a 2-day manhunt.
So much more exciting.
So much more, which was now. This is the problem with the coverage. The two could have happened simultaneously. It's not that you had to completely forget that one other thing. And that's where the problem is, and that's where I suspect, just by talking to normal people. This form of, and you can't see my air quotes, but this form of news dissemination is losing the room. Just the people just aren't good. They're like, yeah, call me when it's over.
They're not losing the room. That's the problem. There are people getting attached to it.
Well, they might be addicted.
And that's exactly what's happening.
They know little else.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Uh-huh.
The networks being sucked into it by their own coverage of it and by their own energy of the story has now transferred to people. And what I worry about, David, is what you said at the beginning of this thing. What happens at the end? What happens when Brexit finally comes to its conclusion? What happens when what happens in Washington finally comes to a conclusion? Because if you look at both those things right now, their conclusion will be inconclusive.
That's right. And so the next thing
I fear so, yeah.
But so the next thing that happens, and I'm not saying this literally, is the people who are either addicted, the 287,000 that live streamed Beto O'Rourke's cooking something on Facebook, some portion of them are going to go out and vote. What's going to happen is there will be a vote, and then the results of the vote from the people that you hope you haven't lost in the room will then pretty much inform / dictate, guide, whatever you like, the next, what comes next. And
well, we'll have to wait and see. But I don't. What I don't see, I'm afraid, is a mass breakout of common sense and rationality.
No,
you can look pretty hard for that. Now, do I have time to just ask a very quick question? I'm told no. Rats.
There's always another time.
All right. Well, then it's going to have to be. Thank you very much, David Tereshchuk, the Media Beat.
Thank you.